It's now my privilege and pleasure to introduce someone who was here last year, someone who's worked very, very hard, one of the hardest working congressmen in the House of Representatives, and someone who, without his efforts and his leadership and his vision, we would not have a $1 trillion transportation bill. Congressman Rick Larsen is from the great state of Washington. He's in his 12th term. He represents the 2nd District of Washington. He is the leading top Democrat on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where the trillion, yeah, let's hear it, why not? Where the $1 trillion transportation bill passed that had billions of dollars for high-speed rail. And when I was in Congress, served with Rick, and I say this unabashedly, he's bipartisan, he's hardworking, he gives the Congress a very good name. Please welcome Congressman Rick Larsen.
Thank you, Ray. Thanks so much for the introduction. I appreciate that. It's you don't get that at home usually, so appreciate it. So I do want to thank the High Speed Rail Association for inviting me back. So I don't know what I said so great last year, but apparently it was enough. As Ray noted, I'm Rick Larsen, and my district is Northwest Washington State, and I'd like to make sure people know it's north of Seattle, none of Seattle. Just to show there's a lot of Washington State north of Seattle, and I get to represent it. If I'm in Bellingham, Washington, near the border, I say I represent from the Canadian border down. If I'm in Everett, which is south of the district, I say I represent Everett north. So there's a lot going on in the district, including high-speed rail and a few other things. I do want to start by going off topic because it's an example, perhaps, of the bipartisanship that Ray mentioned. As a ranking member, I am focused on building a cleaner, greener, safer, and more accessible transportation system to better connect communities, create more jobs, and protect the environment. And the U.S. High-Speed Rail Association, I'm sure, represents all that. There's a great example of that, though, coming up. The House is poised to pass the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024 and send it to the President's desk. This bipartisan bill is another step in America's leadership in aviation safety and aerospace innovation, strengthens and diversifies the aviation workforce, improves consumer protections and accessibility, and makes groundbreaking investments in sustainability and resiliency. Just a few reauthorization notes by the numbers, and I do have a conclusion on this that's relevant. But $4 billion, we're increasing the airport improvement program by $650 million a year. $60 million, that's the increased funding for workforce development grants to grow the next generation of aviation workers. $12 million, this is a set aside within that $60 million for the Willa Brown Aviation Education Program to support outreach and educational opportunities for folks in low-income and underrepresented communities in aviation. And $200 million is a number that represents a new discretionary grant program to design airport resiliency, runway safety, and other key reforms. So I bring that up because we're about to pass a bill that passed 351 to 69 in the House of Representatives last year. The Senate passed a bill out of their committee earlier this year, and we worked together in a bipartisan, in a bicameral way, like the old days, to get legislation done on transportation. And I think it's an example of how we can approach the next version of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the next version of anything, or that, or this, it doesn't really matter. It just takes a lot of work. It takes reaching out to members. It takes listening to members. It takes actually disappointing members at times of doing it respectfully, something that you don't see a lot in Congress. And I think I said something earlier at a different meeting this morning, is like the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure is not, it is an example of bipartisanship in action. It is not bipartisanship in action. It is bipartisanship in action. And we'll continue to be an example of that, and no matter what set of issues we work on. So we expect to pass that bill, have the debate today, and pass it on suspension tomorrow and send it to the President. I hope one more example of what we can do in infrastructure together and long in the future. Now, I will also note, moving to your issues specifically, improving rail infrastructure is another essential component of accomplishing these goals of having a cleaner, greener, safer, and more accessible infrastructure. Without reliable and efficient passenger rail service, cities like Seattle, Spokane, Portland, Eugene, and Vancouver, British Columbia can't connect to communities in my district like Everett, Edmond, Stanwood, Mount Vernon, and Bellingham. Now, my staff wrote it the other way around, like the small cities are supposed to connect to the big cities. I switched that around because I don't represent any of those big cities. They need to come to me, not to them, not the other way around. Got that, Roger? Got it, good, yeah, thanks. Rail provides these travelers with transportation options other than a car. It means less congestion on roads, on bridges, and fewer carbon emissions. Now, 2.5 years ago this week, the Congress passed and the President signed the bipartisan infrastructure law, a bold and long-term investment in infrastructure that is creating jobs, driving economic growth, and improving transportation systems nationwide. There's probably a couple of good reasons why the U.S. is experiencing lower than 4% unemployment rate for the longest stretch in 60 years. Part of that is because women and men around the country are constructing the next generation infrastructure because of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so far, the BIL has invested nearly $454 billion in infrastructure nationwide, with more than 56,000 specific projects identified for funding. The BIL makes available for the first time ever dedicated, reliable federal funding to improve and expand intercity passenger rail. And we've heard from the administrator on this, but it provides $66 billion and authorized another $35 billion for a total of over $100 billion in funding for passenger and freight rail if we can just get the appropriators to do their job. Did this just come out of my mouth? I'm sorry about that. Sorry. So, thank you, Roger. Was that Roger? I don't know. That wasn't okay. But thanks to this investment, Amtrak is renewing and supporting routes like the state-supported Cascades route that runs through my district, a route that people rely on to explore attractions in the Pacific Northwest, and attend events such as the upcoming 2026 FIFA Men's World Cup matches in Seattle and Vancouver, BC. And those are the only two cities you need to care about when it comes to the FIFA games, by the way. But it is important that we have functioning rail between the major cities where the games are being played, just as an example of why this is important. Thanks to this investment, we're also building replacements for the 150-year-old Baltimore and Potomac Tunnel in Maryland and the 110-year-old Hudson Tunnels in New York. These bottlenecks on the Northeast Corridor reduce train speeds and stop passengers from realizing the full benefits of this higher speed rail. Last year, the first grants from the federal-state partnership, as was noted, but Intercity Rail invested more than $8.2 billion in 10 projects in 9 states to improve passenger rail, and that includes $6 billion for high-speed rail projects. As the administration continues to implement the BIL, I'm focused on ensuring communities across the country benefit from these historic rail investments. I'll take some water, whoever's delivering water. Thanks. I'll continue to work with my colleagues in Congress as well to make sure the federal government is a strong partner for these projects. Man, rail just chokes me up. Now, this includes the Cascadia high-speed rail project in my state, which will link Seattle and Portland in as little as 1 hour. Once a staffer, always a staffer, that's right, yeah. Where was I? Increasing job opportunities and enriching communities along that route. So while dedicated rail funding is an important step towards a nationwide high-speed rail network, it's equally important to invest in a more accessible transportation network. It's already been delivered. Can I get 4 more glasses of water? Last Congress, I secured $2 million to construct a pedestrian plaza adjacent to the new Mount Lake Terrace Sound Transit Rail Station, and a lighted paved ADA accessible pathway from nearby Veterans Memorial Park, which actually connects the city center at Mount Lake Terrace to the Link Rail Station. And thanks to BIL, Amtrak is upgrading stations to be more accessible to passengers with disabilities. And earlier this year, our committee approved bipartisan legislation that require Amtrak to report to Congress on the status of ADA compliance at all stations that it serves. In addition to that, I remain committed to ensuring action on rail safety. As the administrator said, this is the #1 priority in any mode of transportation. When I spoke to you last year, the Senate had recently moved a bipartisan rail safety bill out of committee, and a year later, unfortunately, very little has changed. This is an area where the House now needs to act. Democrats on my committee, we held a rail safety roundtable in March with representatives from the communities of East Palestine, Ohio, and Hiram, Georgia, who have had derailments, and the president of the National League of Cities, and from rail workers themselves. City officials from 20 communities attended this online event. So even as we wait for the NTSB's final report for East Palestine next month, there are dozens of open rail safety recommendations that our committee could address. We do not need to wait for the NTSB. We are making progress in some areas, however, and I'm pleased that the city of Burlington, in my district, was a recipient of one of these Chrissy grants, was awarded $2 million for a rail crossing elimination grant to plan which of its 16 crossings that go through this town it could close. As a ranking member, again, and the committee as a whole will always place safety at the forefront of our committees. So thanks to the BIL, we made the largest investment in passenger rail since the founding of Amtrak more than 50 years ago. A high-quality, high-speed, intercity passenger rail network is our goal, and you have my commitment that we will continue to work towards that vision. To achieve this, though, we need to secure long-term investments. The BIL has shown that cities and states across the country want access to high-speed passenger rail. For that to become reality, Congress needs to ensure that guaranteed funding in the BIL is carried over into the next surface transportation reauthorization. Now, there are times when some of my Republican colleagues have sought to defund Amtrak or grant programs for intercity passenger rail. But thanks to advocates like you who have done the hard work of building support in communities for passenger rail and for Amtrak and high-speed rail, we see bipartisan support, more bipartisan support for rail investment. With high-speed rail, your advocacy will need to continue to achieve broad bipartisan support. Let me finally note that this is Infrastructure Week. And as the administrator noted, and I know the president wants an infrastructure decade. Now, we can only have an infrastructure decade if we build on the 5-year bill that we just passed and do another 5-year bill. Because 5 and 5 equals a decade, right? So we are not there yet. I'd also note, and I'd let the administrator and others know in the administration, like, people can have an infrastructure week or infrastructure decade, that's fine. Every day in Washington's 2nd District is infrastructure day. So I'm not waiting a decade, I'm not waiting a week, I'm taking everyone's money and putting it in my district every day to build out my infrastructure, and we'll be the example of how great it can be for everyone else in the country. But I need you all to devote yourselves to making every day high-speed rail day and high-speed rail infrastructure day as well. And not wait for us, wait for Congress, make it happen. It'll help us make it happen for you. Thanks a lot. Couple questions.
All right, we got time for 2 questions. Anybody got a question for the congressman?
Let me start, Rick, by asking if, is it possible, and in what time frame, to get a pot of money for rail? And I know Republicans do not, I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
When I was on TNI, a lot of people on my side of the aisle wanted to cut Amtrak. And when I served as secretary, because it was Obama's idea, nobody wanted to fund high-speed rail. So what do you think the chances are, and can it be done in a bipartisan way?
Well, the chances, well, the possibility is 50-50, right? The probability, however, is probably not even close to that, truthfully. What could happen, could not happen, but I live in the world of probabilities, and right now, I would say the probability of that is pretty low. But first, I would first want you to know that we need to figure out what we want to do first. Let's focus on what we want to accomplish in high-speed rail, and then figure out then what it will take to fund that and how we would fund it. And not necessarily be held back by how we're going to fund things, because we have to figure out that question for a lot of parts of a lot of transportation modes.
I mean, that is a great answer. Figure out what we want before we figure out how much we want. Very good. Good
Yeah,
lesson for all of us.
If you plan to the budget that many members of Congress want, just end this meeting now, because they want nothing. So they don't want to fund anything. So figure out what you want first.
One more question. Anybody? Thank you, Rick Larson.
All right, thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.